Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Lambda Securities podcast. My name is Rosario, and I'm very excited to be joined today by Brad Prince. He's a resident of medical and genomics physician at the Alberta Children's Hospital and a longtime colleague and friend of mine. Brad, welcome to the show. Great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
So, Brad, today I was hoping to talk with you about a few subjects, but obviously the most important thing to our viewers is how they can grow their wealth throughout the future and make sure that they can build their financial freedom. I was hoping to talk to you about, your areas of expertise and some of the technologies and companies that you see coming down the pipeline that provide a good opportunity for people to get invested in. And not only that, some of the technologies that you see improving lives and changing the way that we live today. The first one that I have is telemedicine. We've talked about this in the past before. There's some pretty big companies out there like Teladoc that are doing things, and over the last year we've seen an explosion in the use of telemedicine for sure. What do you think about telemedicine, and where do you see it going in the next few years?
Yeah, I mean, telemedicine is a really interesting concept because it was something that even just kind of look at pre-COVID era, and it was an interest that I had and something that I had looked at initially practicing family medicine. And was something that to me made a lot of sense. We bring a lot of people in primary care in to see their family doc for to see lab results or to see like a prescription refill type thing. And a lot of those visits you don't need to be physically present for. And so what's been interesting is with COVID, everyone shutting down, even physicians' offices being much more restricted in terms of who they'll see in person. You'll see a lot of the older docs are more comfortable on the phone, and so they'll do some phone visits. A lot of the younger docs, you see them being able to facilitate these Zoom clinics and telemedicine clinics where it's not necessarily an in-person visit, but you're able to see a person, you're able to get a feel for how they're doing. And there's a lot of valuable medical information that can be gathered even though the person's not physically present. And so at the end of the day, that's kind of the bottleneck on telemedicine is the amount of information that can be transferred back and forth. So as long as there's not information that I need you in front of me to be able to physically examine you and be able to gather information with my senses or kind of from a primary source, a lot of those visits can be done over Zoom and can be done by telemedicine. So I think there's lots of opportunities in that regard. I think with COVID, we've seen a ton of just booming business with that regard in some of these companies that people weren't able to get in to see their primary care provider, and so we're able to jump on something like Elon Health or any of the kind of number of different healthcare companies. It'll be interesting to see going forward how much that sticks around. Mm-hmm. So after the pandemic, when doctors' offices are completely open and you're able to go back in, there's a lot of people who want to see their doctor in person, who value that relationship in primary care. And there's a lot of actual value that can be extracted in that in terms of just basic counseling, in terms of that human aspect of medicine that's really difficult to quantify with a lab test or with a physical exam. Because at the end of the day, physicians, the goal is to provide good medical care, but it's to look after a person's health. And the lab values and the diseases are only a narrow portion of that. So it'll be really interesting to see, and I think we'll have to wait a little bit for what the markets and what people decide. From what I've seen so far, younger people seem really eager and really willing to accept these visits over the phone and visits over Zoom. What will be even more interesting to me will be whether anybody can start offering things like lab tests and offering things like prescriptions that are able to be done remotely without having to come into the office. So that kind of branches out a little bit more than just primary care providers and into lab services and into pharmacy. But a world where I could visit my family doctor, get a lab test ordered, have an Amazon drone drop off a box that can draw my blood, send it away to a lab. The result comes back as interpreted. Doc says that I need to start on a statin, a type of medication. and that just gets dropped off by another drone or delivery person with the medications. I mean, that's a very different world than, and much more convenient for me. There's a lot of value for that. Compared to me going to my doctor's office, me going to a lab, and then me going to a pharmacy afterwards with a week or two in between, and me having to book off work to be able to go take those appointments. So definitely a ton of potential in there, and a lot of room for expansion even beyond just kind of the basic services that we're seeing offered right now.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's a lot of opportunity for growth in the space, but you think there's still room for a balance between in-person and remote. Do you see any any risks associated with doing these remote meetings, or do you think that a doctor will be able to say if they need you to come in person and talk to them in most cases?
Yeah, and I mean, that's what I think most physicians who are evaluating remote visits versus in-person visits are trying to figure out right now is if you come in, so for example, I had a patient that came in the other day, was originally scheduled to be a Zoom appointment, but they came in and we did an exam, weren't expecting to find anything, but we found a foot drop, which is something that we wouldn't have seen if we had done Zoom, which had a significant impact on the way that we went about treating the patient and the way that we went about testing, and kind of changed things to the side. And if they hadn't been in clinic that day, we wouldn't have seen that. That would have gotten missed.
Right.
So and that's a huge. That's kind of the elephant in the room for doctors, is that most doctors would love to be able to offer their services remotely, be able to make that more convenient for patients, kind of be less of an imposition. But at the same time, that increases a physician's risk to be able to not have the patient in front of them, to be able to exercise and collect all of the data that we're used to getting from an in-person visit.
Yeah. So like anything, there's benefits and drawbacks, just as in any treatment or new technology, and you have to be able to weigh those. And it sounds like though you're in favor of it, and I would assume that. How do you feel about the benefits versus the cost? That's just something that needs to evolve over time, and we need to understand it more. Or
yeah, I mean, I think you're right on what you said a minute ago, and that for the most part, we should be able to figure out who needs to come in person and who we can see over the phone. And just given the ease of telemedicine, it's very reasonable to have a preliminary visit to be able to gather data and try and assess that. So anyone who's got increased risks due to family history, due to lifestyle, due to other illnesses that they have, I mean, to see them as an in-person visit in a more targeted way to try and assess around some of these specific factors is totally reasonable. You know, the average healthy kind of 20-year-old woman who's got no health history, who's in great shape, who's in perfect health, that wants contraceptive, you know, do we need to see that person in an in-person visit? Like, probably not. We can probably see that person over the phone, and we should be able to make that judgment pretty easily just based off a preliminary interaction.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like generally a net benefit. Moving kind of into an area that's similar to telemedicine, I want to talk a little bit about personalized medicine. So this kind of ties in with telemedicine. So the ability to collect data over long periods of time and understand, what conditions somebody might have based on, things like their gait, things like that you can collect with something that you might have on your wrist.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunities going forward with that. I think I saw that the new iOS, actually, for Apple Watch or WatchOS, whatever they call it, has a gait analysis portion of it, and so it'll let you know, especially for older people, one of the biggest risk factors in an elderly person's life are falls. Yeah. Often kind of in the media it's sometimes a bit satirized, but an elderly person that's 75, 85, 95, and occasionally people who are younger than that, a fall very easily results in femoral fracture, which is in frail individuals is one of the common causes of that the decline that leads to death.
Right.
So it may not be the fracture itself, but a fracture results in decreased mobility, and decreased mobility increases your risk for clots and other problems. You get decreased muscle mass, which further decreases your mobility, and you kind of start this decline, which ultimately results in the patient passing. And so even a basic thing like that, of being able to assess based off of a person's gait whether they're high risk for falls or low risk for falls on a day-to-day basis, and being able to update and say, yeah, today your gait is pretty steady, like you're pretty good. And then to be able to the next day say, actually, you know what, today you're a little bit off balance, you should probably take it easy. Those are immensely valuable to those populations, and something that I think the important part of kind of the personalized medicine part of that is that that is not a risk that we were able to assess previously. We could assign a general score and say, yeah, generally you're at increased risk for falls, but the day-to-day analysis is something that wasn't possible before this.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine as things go forward that kind of these micro indicators of our life and of our health will start to be understood a little bit better. We're still just barely at the beginning of this. You look at the data that's collected on your watch, or some of the people have smart rings and other smart devices variously on their body. The amount of data that we collect is usually an accelerometer, so some movement data. Occasionally, the new ones will have pulse oximetry. We can do heart rate, and most of the time that's about it. Some of them will do temperature, and a couple with hemodynamic response. And the number of people that are wearing those is still relatively low. What's interesting to me is, and I think probably an opportunity is, if you look at the diagnosis of sleep apnea, which is when people stop breathing while they're sleeping, and there's diagnostic criteria around how long you have to stop breathing, how many times it happens in the night, it affects your oxygen saturation. What's interesting to me is that the new update on the Apple Watch is able to track the respiratory rate while you're sleeping, and it is able to track oxygen saturation while you're sleeping, and it is able to track heart rate and accelerometer data.
So it's basically like getting a sleep study done at your own home every night.
So theoretically, Apple could be doing research to be able to validate that, and they would have to validate that against a standard of care. So it would be an Apple Watch, and it would be whatever the devices they typically use for sleep study. And if they were able to say that our watch is able to diagnose as good or better, it would be really, really interesting, because then with an update, suddenly, however many million Americans that have Apple Watches, and Canadians, and anyone else who has an Apple Watch, could theoretically get a diagnosis of sleep apnea overnight.
Given the limited nature of the hardware that you mentioned, do you think that because you have a larger sample size and you have longer term tracking and stuff, that kind of outweighs the downsides of having a limited sensors in the device versus like going in and doing a full study in a hospital kind of thing?
With the sleep studies specifically?
Yeah, well, just related to, I don't know, I guess there's a lot of concerns out there about that the sensors on the devices aren't accurate enough, that they're not good enough to make any meaningful draw any meaningful conclusions from.
Yeah, I mean, you may not be able to reliably use them to rule out a diagnosis, but it was so I have an Apple Watch, and it's got an ECG on it,
Mm-hmm.
and so I was able to use that. I was having chest pain a little while ago. It's not designed to be able to diagnose chest pain, but I have training in it, and it gives me leads to ECG, and so I was able to look at that and see that I was having some PVCs, some preventricular contractions. And based off of that, like that was the explanation for why I was having some chest discomfort, was that I was having these PVCs.
Right.
Um, the machine technically isn't doing that. The sensor isn't great. There's a lot of things it can't do, but at the same time, it will be able to diagnose those things that it can detect with the sensor sensitivity that it has. And, and even though it won't be able to maybe diagnose other conditions, so even something like a posterior myocardial infarction or a heart attack, you look at the normal ECG that we have, that test has 12 leads, and you actually need 15 to be able to definitively diagnose that posterior myocardial infarction. The 12 lead can't diagnose that, but it can give you suggestions that tells you that you may need to go to that 15. And I think that's probably what the role for these consumer devices are at this point. Is it may not be able to diagnose you with Parkinson's based on the accelerometer data. It may not be able to pick out that this is Parkinson's versus another non-specific movement disorder. But I think it'll get to the point where it'll be able to give you an alert and say, hey, you should probably see someone. You've got some abnormal movement.
And would it help in, like, as a piece of evidence for doctors to make a diagnosis? Like, they can use that as part one, and then some other things that they gather with more detailed testing?
Yeah, well, and I think the challenge with that is that medical devices themselves don't change very frequently. And most of the diagnostic criteria that we have right now are based off of these kind of legacy medical devices. So to meet the formal diagnostic criteria for some of these disorders, you kind of have to go through the exact steps that are listed.
Right.
Longer term, I think that may be the case, that we may be able to make diagnosis based off of these consumer devices. So, for example, like atrial fibrillation, like somebody who does not have a diagnosis of atrial fibrillation can use their ECG on their Apple Watch to demonstrably show atrial fibrillation.
Right.
And a qualified physician, would be able to take that and say, this is AFib. I don't need to bother getting an ECG because I've got the data and I can show and point to it and say, this is AFib. And so you're starting to see that with some disorders, but it kind of needs to fit within the scope of what the sensors can get.
So maybe actual diagnosis is a bit further off, but you can at least use it as a tool to say, hey, I should probably go talk to my doctor about this. There might be something of concern going on here. Along those lines, do you think that there's a risk of people coming in more frequently for things that are not actually a problem, like increase in kind of hypochondria tendencies?
Oh my gosh, that happens all the time.
Yeah.
Consumer genetic testing, you see that with a lot. So I'm in medical genetics and genomics. And so you see the people with 23andMe or people with other consumer genetic testing that get a result back and have questions about it, because in our discipline, a significant component of it is to be able to translate this hardcore scientific data into something that's meaningful, that a person can take and apply to their lives and know how that affects them. Unfortunately, the way that a lot of companies have implemented their genetic testing, and I don't think 23andMe is. I think 23andMe generally actually isn't as bad as some of the other companies. Is just that they will do the test and give you the data, and that data is often difficult to interpret for people who are experts in the discipline, let alone for a lay person who is having a hard time spelling DNA. So I can't even remember what the initial question was. Sorry, remind me.
We were just talking about kind of how
the
increase in hypochondria. I guess I'm kind of asking for your opinion on whether this is a net positive, or if they're like also if you see a risk of having too many people coming in. Like, is it going to lead to overwhelming doctors with a whole bunch of people thinking that they have things that they don't have?
Yeah, and I think that's the balance, and I think that's one of the things that regulators look at as well, because even if you look at the Apple Watch, to be able to make the diagnosis of atrial fibrillation, or even suggest that you may have atrial fibrillation, had to go through regulatory approval and had to do clinical trials and had to be able to show it against standard of care and come up with a number within a reasonable degree of accuracy as to how well it was going to be at making that diagnosis and how many false positives. And I'd like to think that regulators keep that in mind as they're approving devices, is the number of false positives, because that's something that obviously in Canada we've got a socialized healthcare system, and so when somebody comes in with a false positive, that visit is a price that we all pay as a society, because it's not free healthcare. The doctor's getting paid, the lab's getting paid, everyone along the chain's getting paid. It's just that we all pay that cost together. So
Right.
I would like to think that the healthcare, that the regulatory bodies have that in mind.
Okay. Do you think that in the long term we're going to see the ability for wearable devices and I guess in combination with some of the other things you mentioned, like genetic testing, to lead to improvements in health overall?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're already starting to see that a little bit. Even something as basic as a Fitbit, of being able to track the number of steps that you have as a day, um, to be able to see an effect on people's health with that, to be able to encourage people to take more steps in the day, which has resulted in improved fitness overall, uh, reduced weight, better metabolic status. There's cascading effects from exercise into appetite and into inflammatory systems. And so, kind of the ability for these small devices, even with just little nudges, to be able to make a big difference in our lives, I think is huge. And I think you hit the nail on the head. Is that they'll probably affect more health than they do illness at first. And I think we've had this conversation a couple of times back, but if you look at trying to improve illness, it's really easy, because if I have somebody who's sick in the ICU and I want to know if what I'm doing is helping, I just look at a number of those people in ICU, and I have an answer in a couple of weeks as to whether what I've done is something that's helpful.
Oh,
If I want to look,
can we pause for a second? My camera just cut out. Not sure what happened.
yeah.
Okay, so where were we? We were talking about, I guess, net positives of the technologies as they emerge in the future. It sounds like it's overall you're pretty bullish on the technology as a whole. Something that I learned recently, and I hadn't really thought about it, but it was something that Warren Buffett said in a shareholder meeting, and it really kind of struck a chord with me. He said, let's say that you, like 100 years ago, you caught a quick glimpse into the future and you saw all the highways and the cars and how big of an impact the automobile would have on the automobile industry. But you didn't get like a close enough look to see like which car companies and stuff it was. And you went back in time and you tried to make a bunch of money by investing in the auto industry. Like you would not have, unless you could pick the companies, you would not have made any money, because like 95% of auto companies failed. So I want to bring that back to the conversation that we were just having, in that it's so hard to predict like which companies are going to have regulatory success and which ones will get through first and which ones will kind of make those advances. Are there any companies in the telemedicine or wearables space that you see being successful? Like I know Apple, I just saw an article a couple of days ago that said Apple was having some difficulty, even like they're trying to get some of these new technologies through, and they're placing a lot of their bet on their future on personalized medicine. But even Apple, the $2 trillion company, is finding it hard to get stuff approved. So what are I would appreciate your thoughts and insight on that. I know it's a hard question.
At the end of the day, medicine is way harder than anybody expects it to be. It's extremely unforgiving. In most parts of business, even if your product doesn't function 100% like you expect it to, and oftentimes if your product doesn't function at all, you can still rely on sales to kind of get it into somebody's hands and make some money from it, for better or for worse.
Right.
and the reality of what your product is and what your product does doesn't have to match 100% with reality. And that's different in medicine, in medical devices, and in pharmaceuticals. Um, with the entire purpose of the regulation, and I'm not sure how many people will be familiar with this, but what it means to have a drug approved means that one, you're allowed to advertise it, and two, you're allowed to say that it does something. So if you take this, that reduces your chance of this. So for something like, I don't know, heart medication is one of them. So if you take this, it reduces cholesterol, or this is known to reduce cholesterol. Anywhere else in business, well, pretty much anywhere else, you're allowed to say that this improves your workflow by 750%, or you're allowed to make kind of you have quite a bit of leeway in terms of the claims that you're allowed to make, what you're allowed to put on advertisements. You're allowed to have, sexy people on a beach running around and frolicking and having a great time. Those are often restricted quite a bit more in medicine and medical devices. And so you have this restriction on terms of what you're allowed to say. And then at the end of the day, you have to have an engineering team and a medical team that can both build something that can do something useful in the body, which is the most complex entity that we have encountered in the known universe. And we essentially want to reach into this bundle of wires and mix of molecular jello and try and change just one little itsy bitsy piece to try and do something without having an effect on the rest of it. And to be able to do that is extremely difficult, as evidenced by the billions of dollars that it takes to get a drug to market and the number of drugs that get to clinical trials that have an excellent theoretical basis, that have excellent preclinical data, that have excellent initial clinical data. And when you put it up in a randomized control trial with a large number of individuals, that it fails. And so that happened recently with some Parkinson's gene therapy trials, which people were really, really hopeful would be able to stave off some of the symptoms of Parkinson's and be able to help maybe with recovery and kind of terminating the progressive decline of this terrible illness. It got to human trials. The initial data looked pretty promising. That it looked like it had an effect. It looked like the effect size was pretty sizable. And then when it got to the larger clinical trials, statistics kind of was a bit of a bitch and
kicked in.
In the initial trials, it must have been a statistical aberration or a problem with the methods that had shown that initial effect size. And you see that all of the time, and it's with very well-intended people that it's trying to show this is extremely difficult. And so kind of the net takeaway from that is that medicine is extremely difficult, and you have to have a team that can build the thing that does it, and then have a team that can actually run the clinical trials to be able to show that it does it in a convincing way, so that regulators will let you tell people and let you sell this thing to do that. And it always costs more money and takes longer than anybody anticipates. And so honestly, of all of the people in the wearable space, you look at Fitbit, you look at some of the companies that have been using Android on smartwatches. You look at something like the Oura Ring that has a bunch of sleep tracking in a ring format. When I look at all of them, really the only company that has been able to go about it kind of in a stepwise manner, been able to start small, gain enough of a market share that they're have enough data to be able to actually run the trials that they need and be able to have enough influence that they can get developers and have enough cash that they can have the scientists and be able to afford to sink, $2 or $3 or $4 billion into a project and have it fail. is honestly it's Apple. That's the only company that I've been able to see that's been able to do that. And they've initially I was pretty skeptical. I thought they were going to go pretty aggressively. Actually, we saw Google in this space a while back. I think Google still has a couple of health plays with Verily that had some really interesting clinical trials, and their electroceutical trials were actually quite interesting to me. And they've got a couple of other longevity plays and pharmaceutical plays and stuff like that. But Google initially had tried to they had tried to step in to the pharmaceutical development, medical device development initially with, I can't remember exactly what the product was called. It was basically a health record system. Just put a health record system on your phone. What was it?
So to summarize what you're saying, I'm hearing that the human body is hard and complicated. Proving efficacy of drugs and medical technologies is hard and complicated.
Apple's been able to do it reliably over the last couple of years. And
Apple's been able to do those reliably.
Google tried and they sucked. They gave up. They spent $1 billion and said
so
it was
it's. So would you suggest against putting a bunch of money in one of these like medical startups then, like unless you really deeply understand what they're doing and have some inside knowledge about whether they're going to get, like, even if you did have inside knowledge, you probably still wouldn't know what the results of their final randomized control trials are going to be. Like you were saying, like they had all these successes before and then they get the results of the RCT and it's nope.
And I forget what the exact statistic is. I think it's only about 1 in 10 drugs that enter into clinical trials will finish clinical trials successfully. So yeah, like an early stage company,
Right.
I would be very wary of whatever their marketing rhetoric is and whatever they're claiming to do, unless you've got enough knowledge that you can see kind of that underlying utility to either healthcare or health in general, and you can see that pathway through regulatory approval.
So for someone who believes in these technologies as you do, how would you recommend, like, if you want to see these technologies grow, how would you recommend getting involved in that? Like, would you go for something like ARK Invest genetics and biotech ETF so you get a piece of all of them, or is there some sort of strategy that you would take?
Honestly, something like an ARK fund would probably be a safe bet. The field is just so broad and the regulations so intensive and the science so complex that even for me in areas that I'm comfortable with, picking winners and losers is challenging.
Mm-hmm. That's I think that's good advice for people because, I mean, I know, like, I see all these companies coming up and they have some pretty amazing claims and you're like, well, if they do this, they could change the world. But like, I'm not a doctor, and then you are a doctor, and you're saying you understand this stuff, and you're saying it's hard to predict whether it'll be successful or not, right? So for the average Joe out there, like how can we even do that?
Yeah, and I find that biotech companies right now are very well capitalized, and so and I think a little bit due to COVID is that people have become aware of it. And even before COVID, biotech traditionally had a higher return than other segments of the market, and so it's an area that venture capitalists hoard a lot of expertise in. And so a lot of the people who are in a position to be able to evaluate for kind of from a basic science perspective and to be able to evaluate from a regulatory risk perspective are kind of hoarded up in these entities that don't publish very much and don't really let other people know what they're up to. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. Like, it can be pretty secretive, and especially for the companies that aren't public, because there's a lot of pre-public companies in this space. What are your thoughts on going into something like medical technology / drug adjacent? Because I know you mentioned that, like, for something to be approved as a drug, it has to show safety and efficacy. But I know, like, for the FDA, for example, I think for like supplements, you just have to show that they won't kill you, they won't harm you, basically.
The bar is a lot lower for those, which it's sometimes a bit frustrating because some of the claims are definitely not evidence-based. Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of opportunities for those. I would look at those more like uh, probably evaluate them similar to like a cosmetics company of something that is um, not necessarily essential in that you're not going to live or die based on having it. But something that a lot of people find nice to have and find reassuring, kind of the same way that a lot of people like to wear makeup or like kind of specific brands that way. Not something that's gonna make you or break you, but something that can make you feel more confident about yourself, and make you feel more comfortable, and make you happy in your own skin. Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for those.
Well, the placebo effect is very
Yeah, yeah.
powerful, right? So
It was funny because
Yeah.
in some of my research before I got into medical school, I was working with a contract research organization, which actually is would be a good opportunity. I'm not sure how many of them are publicly listed, but a contract research organization is basically a company that has lab space and lab technicians that a pharmaceutical company can rent. So pharmaceuticals, the way that the industry is typically broken up is that there's lots of teeny tiny companies that are working on a single drug candidate. And so they raise a bunch of money, but buying a lab is expensive, and at the end of it, after you finish your experiments, you're left with a lab that you're not going to use because you need all the equipment for your next stage to go into either animal trials or human trials, which you don't need that basic equipment for anymore. So a contract research organization provides that as a service. So me as a pharmaceutical company, I would go raise a bunch of money, and then I would hire this lab to do the work. They're in a really nice position because whether a drug gets approved or not approved, they get paid both ways.
They get paid, yeah. So maybe those are companies that you might want to look at, are the ones that, they get paid whether the drug gets approved or not. So those
Those
are,
would be good choices.
maybe a bit more reliable investment. Yeah. So it's kind of like, I would almost think of that as like almost like a maker space for drug companies or drug startups. Like they're going in there and they're using their equipment to do their research, and then someone else can come along. Like, how specialized is that equipment? Like, can you do multiple things, or is there a lot of risk that they go and order all this specialized equipment and then it's no good?
Yeah, no, the
within a
machines
couple of years.
the machines typically have relatively long service lives. So, I mean, you get a PCR machine, and a lot of research labs are using PCR machines that are 10, 15, 20 years old type thing. The basic technology, I mean, there are advancements there, but kind of those basic things, test tube is a test tube type thing. A lot of the infrastructure around it to be able to deploy it reliably and deploy it effectively, that are the most important things. And then the nice thing is that because you're contracted, if there's something that a research company or that a pharmaceutical company wants you to do that you don't have the equipment for, you can bill them for access to that equipment. And then you go and you access a contract research organization that has it. So it kind of gets, it's the NASA principle of that everything kind of gets farmed out to the lowest bidder.
What do you think of like is there a risk for those? I don't know if this is the same kind of company, but this is kind of old news at this point, but what's the risk of a company like Theranos coming through again, where they're like making all these claims about all this technology that they have for doing diagnostics and stuff like that, and then it turns out to be pretty, I guess, unproven?
Yeah. So, how do I avoid a company like Theranos? So, Theranos was really interesting in that they never published anything on any of their methods. I think there was a single paper published by Elizabeth Holmes while she was an undergraduate student. And then actually, so what they were using as proof of function, essentially. So when they went to a venture capitalist and they were saying, well, how do we know that your stuff works? What they would do is they would produce this patent portfolio of 50 or 100 patents that they had been granted. And say, well, look, we've got all of these patents. Clearly our stuff works. Which, if you know how patents actually work, a patent doesn't have to work for you to get a patent.
Yeah, I saw just on another note, I saw some patents from the U.S. government that showed they had like a
Oh yeah.
warp drive and all this other crazy stuff. And it's like, yeah, okay, they have a patent for it,
Yeah,
but does it actually
absolutely,
do anything?
absolutely.
Like,
And so
yeah.
that was one of the things that should have been a red flag for Theranos was that they were relying on patents as their proof of function, and they hadn't published anything actually. That I'm aware of. And especially nothing around the particular methods that they were using or to be able to show that those methods were functional. But if they had the patents on them, they should have been able to publish on them without risk of people copying their technology because they were protected. The other thing was that if you look at their leadership team, it was largely made up of people who had no experience in biotech. So, Henry Kissinger was one of the members of the board. There was, I believe, if I recall correctly, one of the generals from the U.S. military was on the board. And you look at kind of the typical people that account for a board of a biotech company, it's usually people with significant experience that understand the underlying risk, or people that have access to those types of people as part of their own organization. So that was another red flag, is that the people that were recruited were people who didn't understand the fundamental technology. So you didn't see people, kind of the traditional investors, that if the technology would have functioned, would have been super eager to jump on board and would have been serving up money left, right, and center, like the Cold Ventures and some of the other biotech venture capital firms that led down the street from Stanford where Elizabeth Holmes was. None of them had jumped on board, which should have been another red flag.
So like you said this earlier, and I just want to reiterate it for everyone who's listening, because I think that's a really key point that you made just on patents there. Like, a company that has a bunch of patents, it doesn't necessarily mean anything. So that's something that is critical to look at. Like, you got to look at their technology. You have to look at who's on their board and who their leadership is. Like, are they people who actually understand the field that these technologies are supposed to be in? Where the money's coming from, obviously. And then you mentioned that, like, randomized control trials or the big kind of end game studies or something to look at. It almost seems like you want to look for companies that are either repurposing or kind of making new uses of old existing proven technologies in new ways, like you were saying, like the labs that are using equipment that's already been approved, but renting them out instead of like a new business model for technology that already exists.
Yeah. And so if you look at even for medical devices, and it kind of varies a little bit from person to person, or from industry to industry, sorry. But in medical devices specifically, there's something called a 510K, which is one of the aspects of regulatory approval, which is basically saying that there's a thing that exists that does the thing that we want to do that works, and we know it works. So, like, if I want to build a new ECG machine, I can use the 510K route and say there's an ECG machine that works, that functions, that does the same thing mine does, and it's substantially the same. I'm not making any significant changes to that technology. And doing that, you're allowed to actually piggyback and skip a bunch of steps of regulatory approval for medical devices. The alternative is you've got to go through a pre-market approval process on the new device, which is long and arduous and expensive, which is why we don't see a ton of new devices, because the process is extensive. Because if you've got something that's going to say that I can diagnose a heart attack, you want to be able to make sure that that thing actually can do what it says it does. That process is a little bit different for diagnostics, or like for Theranos, and kind of the randomized control trials are executed in a slightly different way. But similar type of thing, of that if I want to build a new lab test, it's easier for me to actually just find a new way to do an existing lab test than it is to come up with a new marker and say that this marker is predictive of XYZ.
Right. So it's a new process for something that's already being done, rather than trying to reinvent or invent some totally new
lab. Paradoxically,
so there are some
improvements are more likely to happen in medicine than disruptive improvement. Disruptive improvement is frowned upon and it is extremely expensive in medicine.
Mm-hmm. So like, whereas, so that almost throws some water on what ARK Invest is saying, because they're all about disruptive innovation. So if they're pushing heavily all these companies that might change the medical space, you're saying, well, like, sure, like they might have great technologies, but it's like, are they going to get approved and are they going to come to market? Because there's a lot of pushback.
And honestly, I believe that even from my perspective with the expertise that I have, someone like a hedge fund manager in the space, I think is a far better position to be able to actually make some of those judgments and have resources that I don't have in terms of people who have personally gone through the regulatory process and can have those insights into those considerations.
So you would agree with like Peter Lynch and Warren Buffett, where they say invest in companies you understand, and generally, if you're in the ordinary population like myself, you're probably not going to be in a position to invest in these companies because you're not.
Yeah, I think given the number of tech companies that go boom, the further you are.
Not boom in a good way, boom in a bad way, right?
Yeah, I would say if you're investing in individual companies in biotech, unless you understand that fundamental technology and that underlying premise real deep and have experience kind of with the regulatory process and are super confident in the leadership team, you're more often than not you're going to get burned.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about something that's a little more fun, well, to me at least, and that's life extension. So I've been reading a lot from like futurists, and there was an interview recently with David Sinclair, who's a geneticist at Harvard and author of Lifespan, and he has a cool like technology, and it kind of seems similar to 23andMe, but you basically send them a bunch of your blood tests and they do genetic testing, and then they're supposed to give you a bunch of recommendations for what you can do to extend your life. How do you feel about products like that, and where do you have a perspective on that space?
I mean, I think they're a little bit unique, to be honest. To be able to look at your genome and be able to say these are the things you need to do to be able to extend your lifespan. This lifespan at this point is, I feel that it's premature. I don't feel like we're there yet as an industry. And I'm sure that Dr. Sinclair would make his arguments. But I think on the fundamental premise of that if you were taking a sample and sending it to this company and expecting a meaningful extension, so I'm talking like 5, 10, 15 years extension of your lifespan, and that's your expectation that that's what you're going to get from this, I just don't feel that those claims are substantiated at this point.
Yeah, it kind of feels like something that, like, how could the companies existed for a couple of years? Like, how could they ever prove that what they're doing is, like, this kind of falls into me one of those things that's like on the side of medicine, because it's not like you don't have to. I almost guarantee they didn't have to prove that this was effective to be able to market.
Yeah, guaranteed not. So they're not going to be able to make any recommendations that hurt you. Yeah. So they're not going to be able to, it's not going to be the drinking bleach type thing. So it's something that maybe a bit fun, that some people may enjoy and maybe people feel better about themselves. I mean, it's kind of the same thing for 23andMe initially, of being able to say that, being able to predict your ancestry, of probably not a lot of harm in it. A lot of people will find it interesting. The company will make a bunch of revenue from it, I'm sure. In terms of actually making a meaningful difference in terms of lifespan or your risk of illness, like probably negligible.
So, are there any technologies or companies that you see right now that are actually making an impact on life expectancy and life extension?
I mean, that's a challenging one. And maybe I'll specify a little bit, because I think you're referring to life extension in otherwise healthy individuals that
Yeah, I suppose it would be like life extension beyond whatever you can live to now. Like if most people can live to around 95, then maybe in 20 years we could live to 125 or something like
Yeah,
that. Is that
well, and I mean, the
possible?
way that we've approached that statistic of kind of the reason why life extension has been happening is because on aggregate, we've been dying of fewer diseases because we've been addressing those diseases one by one. And so if you look at kind of what's going to improve the average lifespan going forward over the next 10, 15, 20 years, um, yeah, you'd probably be safe to bet on the same thing of those diseases that kill people early being treated and being cured are probably going to be the majority of what accounts for the increased lifespan in the average population. So the average person will probably live to close to the same age, but the population as a whole will probably live a little bit longer. But
If you cure all disease, do you think that is there an upper bound on how long people can live if you cure all the
yeah, I
diseases
mean,
that are killing people?
it's one of those things that you're starting to bump into the definitions of what do you call a disease. Is having a predisposition for cancer is
Right.
that a disease? I mean, cancer is the disease, but is the predisposition a disease? Is having fragile blood vessels, is that a disease? Even if that's within kind of normal parameters of what we would expect the average person to have. Is I don't know, is getting hit by a car, is that a disease? Of that, you've got this, we've got this predisposition to trauma in our everyday lives of just the risk that we have by walking down the street. And so, I mean, if you eliminate all of the risks, eventually you're left with the only option is to keep living. Um, but yeah, I think the that we will inevitably live. Sorry, kind of your initial question of if we cure all disease, will we live indefinitely? Um, there's lots of other things that we die from other than chronic disease.
Uh, okay, that's good to know. So, well, I guess so. Chronic disease is not why people are not living to 150. Is that kind of what you're saying?
No, I don't think so. There's lots of other reasons why people die.
Okay.
Um, I mean, some of it is just as you get older, you get kind of you get changes in the body that happen as a byproduct of physiology. The same way that your body isn't the same at 45 as it was at 25, and isn't the same at 25 as it is at 15. There are things that turn on and there are things that turn off within the cells that result in net changes. In and of themselves, they're not disease. It's just the way the body has progressed. So
I think this is a good opportunity to transition into your area of specialty, which is genetics, because it sounds like what you're talking about has a lot to do with either your genome or maybe
yeah,
your epigenome. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you're doing right now and maybe what you see going on in
yeah.
genetics right
So I
now?
don't have too many projects that I'm actively working on at the moment. So I'm a resident physician at the Children's Hospital. So in medical genetics and genomics, my area of interest is in genetic therapy specifically. And so what is going on in the space currently is treatments for Mendelian disorders primarily. And so what that means is um, diseases that we can track back to individual genes. So if you look at something like hemophilia, which is a propensity to bleed, or you look at something like sickle cell disorder, which often is a single, so you got billions and billions of nucleotides, which are the individual elements of DNA, that a single one of those has been switched. And that's the difference between having sickle cell disease and not. You look at things like uh, well, there's thousands of them, so obviously won't list them all. But a lot of these diseases are really expensive, and traditionally we've been treating them with the thing that's missing. So if you have someone with a bleeding disorder, you give them the clotting factor that's missing. If you have somebody who has sickle cell disease, when they come in and they're in trouble, we actually do if they're in enough trouble, we'll do exchange transfusions or give them blood transfusions. So we actually need to remove the sickled cells and put in good ones that don't sickle. so that they don't end up with blocked blood vessels and problems with their hearts and problems with their brains. There's a whole class of disorders called metabolic disorders, which goes back to what some of us recall with disdain from university of the Krebs cycle and glycolysis, and basically all of those processes of how glucose and all of the elements of our body are manufactured from a biochemical perspective. And there's lots of teeny tiny machines that we have on our bodies called enzymes, and each one of those are programmed by DNA. And so any errors in any of those enzymes can result in disease. It's often quite severe disease because those are the basic building blocks of life that have been conserved for billions and billions of years. They've been conserved because if you screw them up, that person doesn't live long enough to reproduce. And so those diseases, actually, we're starting to get to the point where we're starting to be able to offer therapies for some of those diseases too. So some of the enzymes, we're able to offer enzyme replacement therapies. And then with gene therapy, instead of just kind of putting a coat of paint on it and trying to fix what's or trying to replace what's missing, the fundamental premise of it is that if I can control the instructions, I can control the machine. And so if I can replace those instructions, replace that bit of DNA that was broken, I can restore that function and make your body do what it originally intended on doing. And so far, those have been actually incredibly successful. The former director of the NIH, Francis Collins, has started talking about a cure for sickle cell disease, which is essentially what we're talking about with these technologies, not treatments for disease, but cures where we actually fix them and they stop happening, and you don't have to go in every 6 months for a treatment. It's just fixed. The same way that if you had a problem with your kitchen and you called in a repairman, they said, "Yep, I'm going to have to come in every 6 months and repatch this tube," you'd be really irritated with that. You just want them to fix the pipe.
Yeah, that's kind of the goal with medicine, right? Like there's a lot of things that are like treatments, but then you're stuck with it for doing that treatment forever. So if you could actually fix the underlying problem, then like, are you saying like you fix this and then you have no
done.
issues in
good.
the future at all?
It's better. And so you look at that. So right now, what you'll see in all the clinical trials right now is you see single gene disorders treated. So diseases where there's one single element that's broken. And so you see that in some seizure diseases, you see that in muscular dystrophy, you see that in some seizure disorders, you see that in a whole bunch of hematology. So like I was talking about with sickle cell and hemophilia. And there's 3,000 some odd genes that happens for. And so what I would predict over the next couple of years is that you're going to see gene therapies coming out for the majority of these. After that, or at some point during that, what I think you're going to see is we're going to start to figure out that we can actually control the instructions in other cells. So you'll see, so I think atherosclerosis is a project that's actually going on. It's a buildup basically of soap. So you have the cholesterol that gets into a cell, it gets processed into the cell, and gets processed into something that's basically a telephone booth. Once it gets processed into that, it's stuck in the cell, and there's no way for it to get out. It can't go out through the cell membrane. There's no transporter for it to get out, and it can't be metabolized into something different that can get out. And so it's just stuck there, and it builds up. And that's some of the basis for these atherosclerotic plaques that you get, which are the buildup in blood vessels. And so it'd be relatively easy for us to figure out an enzyme that converts that into something else that can get out of the cell, and then to be able to administer that to people who have known blood vessel disease, and to be able to theoretically reverse that. And then once you can do that, now suddenly everyone who can't process these metabolites in these cells, everyone who gets blood vessel disease, even if that's a normal part of the history of kind of the evolution of people's bodies, and everyone has some, even healthy people have some in their blood vessels. Now suddenly everyone who was previously at baseline now has a disease. And so we advance that, and then suddenly everyone should get treated for that. And I think you'll start to see that being iterated, and you'll see that across a bunch of different things. You'll see engineered transplants for type 1 diabetes. You'll see they'll start out simple of just a single gene, and I think eventually you'll see them evolve into these complex networks that are realistically just micro robots that can go and do specific jobs in your body.
So this is incredible. I just want to point out that I'm kind of hearing two lines of thinking here. So on the one hand, you're like, don't invest in all these companies that are doing all this disruptive stuff. And then on the other hand, you're like, look at all these incredible disruptive innovations that are coming through in genetics. How do you reconcile those? You think that they're going to happen, but it's just hard to predict who is going to make it happen first. Like, it's going to happen. It's just like, we just don't know which company will do it.
So part of it is that picking the winner is going to be challenging, and the other side of it is just a capitalization thing of who has access to the money to be able to do this. Because if you want to get to the end point of what, one system that I envisage for the future, and that if I'm able to make enough money and have a company that's able to be well enough capitalized, the project that I'd like to work on, is a reprogrammable immune cell. And so what that means, the way that, and I'm sure that you've talked about how immunizations work, but you present a molecule to your immune system, and your immune system recognizes it, blows it up, destroys it, and then saves that information for later, so that when you see it again, instead of having to figure out how to destroy it, it just pulls up the information. So what I would like to see, and what I hopefully see before I retire, is an engineered immune cell that just lives in your bone marrow, which is where a lot of your immune cells live. That you're able to take a pill, or even cooler. What would be best is that it's Wi-Fi connected, or whatever the equivalent is. At that point of time, and instead of having to see and figure out for itself how to destroy it, you just give it the instructions of how to destroy it, and that just gets pushed as an update, completely passively, that you don't have to worry about. So yeah,
that sounds incredible. I do want to shift the conversation a little bit here, because in my area, which is electric vehicles and autonomous tech and stuff like that, we see a lot of what I like to call FUD. So it's like fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So like lots of people saying, oh no, what if this technology doesn't take off, or this company is doing this stuff that's going to be problematic, or you know what I'm talking about. It's like, it's things that sound legitimate or scary, but if you dive deeper, it's really either nothing or it's way overblown. So when you're talking about like updating your immune cells via Wi-Fi, like the first thing that comes into my mind is like human virus. Like they update it, and then your immune system is programmed to kill you. So how do you and not only that, like just taking a step back kind of to where we are today, and like there's a lot of stigmatism. I don't know how much there is anymore, but like I know there's some stigmatism about like genetic engineering and things like that. So how do you address those concerns, and how do you think that's going to play out?
So the resistance around it fundamentally comes down to a question of who are we as humans, and do we have a right to be able to alter that? And there's a ton of that. Even if you look at the entire GMO movement of like non-GMO foods, the root of that is that food is big and complex and difficult, and one of the arguments is that if we modify this, surely it can't be safe. And the other argument is that this is something that we shouldn't be doing, that morally is wrong. And I see both of those. And so, there's a ton of that. And I gave the wireless immune system because that's, especially in a pandemic, that's something that I think everyone can kind of understand a little bit. Instead of a shot, you get a Wi-Fi update. Obviously, there's tons of ways to abuse that.
Yeah.
Like, I don't even know. Like, that's the start of a novel of how the entire human race ends. Is that?
Yeah, like that sounds like the beginning of a dystopian novel. Like maybe not dystopian, but like a maybe
Yeah, exactly. Like
apocalyptic
that's the start
novel
of
or
I Am
something.
Legend. Is that suddenly
Yeah,
everybody got a Wi-Fi update and
yeah,
two-thirds of us are zombies now. But kind of the point of it
yeah.
that I was trying to make, and I probably gave a little bit too dramatic an example, but that the technology will exist in the future to do fantastic things, things that we would struggle to imagine currently. Um, and so one of the reasons why I'm a bit hesitant on picking stocks and picking companies is that the trail of events that leads us to these systems, which kind of radically transform what it means to be human, um, is paved with trillions of dollars, probably quadrillions of dollars, if I'm completely honest. Um, and the number of trials, and just the sheer volume of work that has to happen for something like that to exist, um, it is astronomical. And it's not a single company that does it. It's a ton of companies that work together on individual elements of it. That somebody figures out the security of it. Somebody figures out how to put your immune system on the blockchain to be able to ensure that every update that you get is secure, and is linked in with clinical trials that are also in a digital format that can't be hacked. And so you're able to verify everything beforehand. There's technologies to address each of these issues. That's one of the reasons why I'm really hesitant to bet on the short term. Is that right now what I'm seeing is that the biotech companies that exist are focusing on a single Mendelian disorders, which is a great place. There's going to be a lot of money in it, but they're super well capitalized right now, and I feel that all of the information that is available to be able to say whether these companies fail or succeed is mostly already integrated into their stock price. That there's a lot of really well-informed people that go in, and they're honestly the ones who probably make a boatload of money from these companies.
So you're saying it's probably really hard to pick a cheap / undervalued biotech company these days.
The ones that I have gone through. I haven't been able to find anything that I feel is a really good deal right now. I feel like there's a couple of them that with some of the like the RNA vaccines that have some promising technology that'll come out. But it's really challenging because as soon as there's so much money tied up in the people that are capable of doing these analyses that by the time the clinical data comes out, somebody's already done the analysis and injected the capital into these companies.
So do you think there's enough people with enough expertise in these areas to know when there's a winner? Because like oftentimes, like I guess like with your specialty, for example, like there can't be that many medical genetics professionals in Canada. So it seems surprising to me that there'd be enough people out there who are knowledgeable enough in this space to make these good investments. But it sounds like you think that
you're suffering a little bit from being in Canada syndrome. Canada has woefully neglected the pharmaceutical development space, which you see in even basic things like the fact that we haven't been able to develop our own vaccine, despite the fact that there are companies in Canada with the capacity to develop and manufacture these type of vaccines. We think that it's a success if we can set up a factory to build somebody else's vaccine, but the idea of having a global pandemic and being able to solve the problem ourselves is something that for some reason just isn't a part of our national identity. And so yeah, in Canada we suffer from this, but in the States there's like if you go around the Bay Area and around San Diego, like I would probably be a moron standing up beside some of the people that these investment firms have to be able to manage these funds.
Right. So you're saying there's a lot of smart people and they understand this stuff and they're working on it, and there's a lot of those people who are already wealthy and are able to make the decisions on
I'm sure there's opportunity. Like I'm sure there's opportunity for long-term investments. And I think that's where something like where the ARK funds and stuff would be useful. Is that the idea is that they would be trying to optimize returns over the short term, but also trying to build a fund that over the long term is going to have consistent returns. And so they're going to pick these companies that feel that they've got the basic science, have a leadership team, have a regulatory strategy to be able to build towards these disruptive futures. And it takes a lot of experience. You know, the average entrepreneur in medicine is usually about 45 or 55 years old, which is significantly older than entrepreneurs in every other space. And that's primarily because of that depth of expertise that's required before you can even start to play and start to throw around ideas that are realistically achievable.
Mm-hmm. Well, it wouldn't be a Lambda Securities episode if we didn't mention Elon Musk. So I wanted to briefly bring up Neuralink, which I haven't really seen a lot about it in the news lately, but I wanted to know your thoughts on their technology. Like, I mean, they're kind of talking about the same sort of procedural steps as you are, where at first they're using it to try to cure some diseases that they almost seem like low-hanging fruit to them, and then later on they're trying to progress to like more like augmentation and improving human lifespan and things like that. How do you see that technology integrating well with genetics, and like do you see a future in that type of? It almost seems like more the mechanical approach, like you're going in and trying to, you know, mechanically.
There's definitely more of a physical integration perspective, which is consistent with kind of Elon Musk's hardware focus in all of his technologies. I always just kind of chuckle when people bring up Neuralink, because I imagine Elon Musk was probably pissed the first time people were like, yeah, we're going to use it for paraplegics. And he was like, no, there's not a billion paraplegics. Like, let's use it to cure depression. And I imagine that he probably had to fire like probably 10 or 15 or 20 people who told him no before he realized that there was just no one that realistically thought that this was achievable as a primary endpoint with a first generation device. And so,
yeah, that's a challenge with being a visionary, is that I've heard that he's fired a lot of people, a lot of very smart people who are telling him, hey, we can't do this stuff right away. So how do you like shoot for those? Because like he's all about, you know, his vision. Like he wants to better humanity, and like, I mean, curing disease is a great thing, but he's looking like not 10, 20, 30 years out. He's looking 100 years out to like extend consciousness. So how do you balance the needs that we have today with that kind of future vision?
I think with brain-computer interface, that's essentially the technology that he's touting, is that he's done wonders for that specific niche, and that brain-computer interface wasn't something that was in the vernacular or wasn't part of the common consciousness. Until Elon Musk brought it up, and you know, a guy with 10 million followers on Twitter, and you know, the eccentric billionaire who's done what already done what people have considered impossible, to be able to suggest another impossible thing, you know, people get on board with that. Fortunately, it's one of those things that when the tide rises, all the boats float. And so all of the other brain-computer interface companies, I think, are really enjoying that. And I think it's a really important discipline, and that there's a lot of work that can be done. Kind of balancing the long-term of, you know, we want to be here in 100 years, with the short-term of, you know, we need something that's not a complete money suck in, that's just going to drive us into the ground. In medicine, I think that's really challenging. Most of the major companies only have a handful of their candidates going through clinical trials at any one time. That's multi-billion-dollar companies that can only afford to have a couple of candidates in clinical trials at a time, because it's so expensive. And so, I think Elon Musk's probably done the right thing in aiming for short-term wins, getting it into people and seeing how it reacts. It's one of the big philosophies in pharmaceuticals and in medical devices, is that you know, the number of times that we've cured Parkinson's and cancer in mice is innumerable. We've done it so many times; it's routine. But we don't care about cancer in mice. We use cancer in mice as a model to the extent that it helps us predict cancer in people. And so that focus on getting into people quickly to see how it reacts and see how people are different, I think is the right approach for Neuralink.
Is that, you say that we've cured all these things in mice. Is that because like of ethics that we haven't done the same thing in humans? Do you think? Is it like
no? So like all of those trials that were done for Parkinson's in humans, like all of those trials cured Parkinson's in mice before they went on to humans. Like it's the basic premise of the clinical trial that you're going to bring a drug to market, it has to work in animals before it works in people, but only 1 in 10 actually make it through all the human clinical trials, even though they work on animals. So,
right.
Yeah, think of that.
So, yeah. Because animals, even though we're fairly similar, we're not identical.
A mouse is not a person, and like you just have to open your eyes and look at them to be like, oh yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think most people could tell you that a mouse is not a person. I would hope.
Kind of working on those long-term plans. I mean, that's the basis of working on any project, and so to be able to take long-term plan, break that up into manageable steps and achievable intermediary goals is the basis of achieving a long-term goal.
Yeah, I think it seems like similar to what Elon did with Tesla. Like first you focus on the small market, low volume car that might not make you profitable, but it gives you enough like notoriety and expertise that you can move on to the more mass market stuff. And that's kind of how you develop it. You have to take that iterative step-by-step approach.
So each individual sale was expensive.
High revenue,
which is the same thing that he's looking at for Neuralink, right? If you want a cell phone price object that everybody can have put into their brain, you're looking at a couple $1,000s maybe. Most people spend less than $2,000 on a cell phone. Probably 99% of people don't spend more than $2,000 on a cell phone. And so for Elon Musk looking at Neuralink, kind of the average person to have an augmented a brain computer interface that lets them listen to music without headphones, like, are you willing to spend $2,000 on that? Like, probably not. Whereas somebody who is paraplegic or quadriplegic who requires full-time nursing care for the rest of their life, you're looking at, $60,000 to $80,000 a year in terms of staffing costs, plus all the additional equipment, plus all the additional investigations, plus all the other illnesses that they're predisposed to. And you want to sell a low volume of them because there's not that many quadriplegics, a proportion of the total population. To be able to sell that and say, I'm going to charge you $250,000 or $500,000 or $1 million for this thing that's going to restore your ability to walk and talk and use your arms and use your legs and become a productive member of society. You have a 25-year-old that becomes a quadriplegic. Even the government's going to get beside that because that 25-year-old is going to be paying taxes for the rest of their life. Whereas otherwise, they're going to be a burden on the healthcare system and they're not going to be able to pay taxes, which we know.
Yeah, I wanna really highlight what you just said there, because a lot of people are like, oh, how can these drug companies or these medical companies gouge people for $500K for this treatment? But like they need to break even on what they're doing, and it's not necessarily that like a person is going to pay that over their lifetime. Like they either have insurance or the government will pay for it, and they're not like overcharging. What they're doing is you have to compare it to the alternative, which is them paying for 24/7 medical care for 50 years. Right?
And right now, gene therapy and these therapies are new, right? And new things, as a rule, are expensive. They're for low volume diseases. They've required a ton of research and development to get there. They've had lots of high development costs. So for them to be expensive, it is the same thing that the Saturn V was expensive as a rocket, of that we just didn't know how to do it. And then you look at that, Elon Musk has been able to bring those costs down.
Yeah, well, it's true with all technologies, and I don't see why it shouldn't be any different in the medical space. Like you look at the development of the automobile, like at first only wealthy people could afford it, and then you have technologies that come through that allow for mass market creation, and then everyone can have an automobile. And you see that in televisions and basically every area of technology. It starts out as a high ticket item, and then it comes down and becomes more accessible. The same reason why we're all allowed to have a supercomputer in our pockets is
mass production economies of scale. And now we've learned how to do it. It's not a mystery how to make a silicon chip anymore. Like you can teach that to a high school class, and you can do that at the back of the room. Whereas if you look at it in the 40s, 50s, or 60s, making a silicon chip was a big deal. And so it's the same thing with these companies. Pharmaceuticals have the nasty propensity of doing value-based pricing as opposed to cost-based pricing, which is nasty, but I say it's nasty, but at the same time, that's what all business is about.
But it's also important to look at it like if the government put in like $10 trillion 50 years ago to try and make an iPhone, they probably wouldn't have been able to do it. Like it took all those intermediate steps and all that development and those first expensive models to be able to make it better and better over time. So like if those expensive ones don't happen, then you never get the cheaper, better, faster ones.
Massive profits bring massive investment into the space of everybody else chasing those massive profits. And as everybody starts chasing it, there's more competition, the prices come down, and it becomes more accessible.
Yeah. Well, on that note, Brad, I want to ask you, I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know we've been talking for quite a while here, but I want to ask you just about if you have one stock pick for our listeners or our viewers, what would it be if you had to invest in one stock? one stock?
Yeah, I mean,
or cryptocurrency or asset class, I guess.
Right now I'm putting a whole bunch of money in cryptocurrencies, and so that's probably if you ask where my money is actually going, that's be transparent, that's where it's going.
So maybe we should talk about that a little bit. Are you a believer? Well, obviously you're a believer in cryptocurrencies. So from your perspective, what do you like about crypto, and why are you investing in it?
I like that it has made a lot of people a lot of money so far. So crossing my fingers for that. It's a good asset class, right? So we haven't had anything like this before. And so I think fundamentally the idea that there can be something digital that is impossible to duplicate and does not require trust is new. Nobody knows what that looks like and what the utilities are. And you see that in just the sheer number of coins that there are in the cryptocurrency markets, of that everybody has a different use case and everyone has something that they don't like about the other one that's slightly different, that, well, there's not a coin that exists like this, so let's just make it. I think decentralized finance is huge and has holds the promise to being able to bring financial services to populations that have traditionally been underserved, whether that's minorities in the developed world that have suffered prejudices, or whether that's individuals in developing countries that just don't have access to financial services.
Yeah, we kind of take for granted in Canada and the US that we have access to a somewhat stable currency, although I don't know how much more. I don't know if you saw the most recent CPI data, but it was like almost 5% inflation year over year. It's a lot. But anyway, so there's a lot of people in the developing world that, they don't have that luxury. Like, your money tomorrow could be worth half as much as your money today. And that's like, that makes it really hard to save and invest and plan for your future. So I really see these technologies as like giving access to that stability, potentially, at least over longer time horizons, to people who haven't had that access before. So it's like democratizing, to use that word.
And a lot of them participate in a global community, right? So we kind of take it for granted that we buy stuff and like that most of our stuff is made in China or made has parts that are made all over the world, and they just kind of come and they arrive, and Amazon delivers them in a box. But to be able to, like my wife is from the States, and I did my undergrad in the States, and so for me to transfer money to the States requires it usually takes 3 to 4 weeks for money to transfer, which is ridiculous because all that money are entries in a spreadsheet. But to be able to authenticate everyone along the chain is hard.
Yeah, people talk about how slow it is to transact with Bitcoin, but you can transact with Bitcoin across
Yeah.
borders in
And I think that's one of the
a
huge
matter of
applications
minutes.
is for international
And
settlements, which
yeah.
we've talked about a couple of times that I'm pretty bullish on XRP, because it's a
Mhm.
coin that does that specifically in its initial incept, like it was built to do that, and then has a corporation on the side that builds all of the corporate systems that integrate with that, which I think is really interesting. Unfortunately, all of this stuff with the SEC right now, but I would anticipate that resolves amicably. Um, yeah, so I think international settlements is one thing. Being able to have access for kind of democratize it, give people who didn't previously have access to services. Um, I, I think those are all worthy things that are worthwhile endeavors, and that's on top of all of the other applications that will come out with NFTs and with what people are able to do with smart contracts, which I'm sure 5 or 10 years from now we'll look back and be like, oh, that's what we thought that we were going to use cryptocurrencies for. Like, oh wow, we were a bit naive.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing to think that we probably don't even know what these technology, like we can't even envision what these technologies are really
Yeah.
going to end up like in 10 years. So there's a lot of progression. But yeah, just to summarize our entire conversation, basically what I'm hearing is medicine is incredibly complicated. Hashtag XRP to the moon.
Hashtag not financial advice.
Hashtag not financial advice. Yeah, I gotta always put that disclaimer in there. I don't want anyone thinking that we are telling you where to invest your money, because obviously you need to do your own research and we are just
Yeah.
having a conversation. So take this information with a grain of salt. Obviously, I value your insights and opinions. And Brad, thank you so much
Yeah,
for
pleasure.
talking with me. And hopefully some people see this, because I think they can
Hopefully
get some
so.
value out of it for sure.